morning, everyone. Welcome to Regenerate. Oh my gosh, we have such a special guest today. One of Australia's biggest legends, and certainly within our community, one of the heroes of so many people in our audience. David Holmgren, welcome to Regenerate. We are so honoured to have you here with us today.
Oh, it's great to join you.
Welcome, David. And we have another really special guest, and this is our first Regenerate podcast where we've invited one of our donors to come in.
Woo!
So we sent out a beautiful email a couple of weeks ago inviting a few that wanted to come in and meet David and talk to David and have ask some questions. So welcome, Kalinya. We're not going to put you on the spot straight away. We'll give you a little time to breathe. So
let's put David on the spot. Let's
put David on the spot.
Yeah. All right, David, go.
No. All right, David. So David,
you're not going to say anything about who I am.
Well, I think the wonderful thing about permaculture and regenerative agriculture is that there's been a real sort of merging and a syntropic process that's been going on with the way that they're sort of wiring and firing. And I just probably to start with, I'd really love to pick your brains about where you felt that merging started to happen in regenerative agriculture and the syntropic agriculture space that you work in.
Yeah, well, I suppose since the publication of Permaculture 1 back in 1978 and the way permaculture sort of burst into the popular consciousness in Australia and then was spread around the world by Bill Mollison, that was an incredible sort of boost to all of these ideas we consider sustainability, regenerative agriculture now, and even preceded the whole development of certification in organics. But one of the downsides of that was a bit that permaculture became a bit of a self-referencing sort of world, from the way I saw it anyway, as an observer of it as a social movement. And one of my roles was to always point out all of the parallel and collaborative processes that were happening from many, many different sources, even back then. And so to avoid that, self-referencing, rather than, government departments being in silos, social environmental change agents being in silos in their own little world. But in terms of the big step, in terms of in Australia bringing a lot of those things together, I think Charles Massey and his book Call of the Reed Warbler has done an amazing amount in sort of drawing together the threads of the fact that a lot of the pioneers in this field are sort of cranky, visionary individualists. And there's been that sort of heritage when you look at, the brilliance of people like Alex Podolinsky in biodynamics and Bill Mollison in permaculture, and or going back to P.A. Yeoman's, these dare I say Peter Andrews, these visionary people who are sort of not necessarily sort of collaborative, but I think those ideas and the commonalities between them are very strongly coming together.
Yeah, they're definitely functioning. The community has come around all of those individuals so strongly. They don't even have a choice now. They've been pushed like with a tidal wave of collaborative community energy. It's been really fascinating. We've definitely engaged Peter Andrews a few times and had a...
I think we actually had a podcast with Stuart Andrews a few months ago, and we talked about blackberries. And blackberries were akin to Peter, and he was very open, and that blackberries have a really important place in the landscape.
Yeah.
As a weed, but however they're prickly.
Yes, well, of course, I've been a great advocate of and practitioner of the more holistic approach to, what's seen as pest plants and pest animals, that drawing together both the perspectives that come from a deep ecological perspective that looks at all plant biomass is doing something, and it's about how we manage that rather than demonising species, and that accords actually with Indigenous views where everything is a part of nature. There's not sort of like good and bad nature, but of course in different management situations we've got to preference and bias things, but the war on weeds is sort of been one of the sort of dysfunctional precursors to a series of other wars, conceptual wars that generally fail.
So David, can you share with our audience, I mean, we have spoken a little bit on weeds, but from your perspective and what do you mean when you say how important weeds are? Like why are they so important? Can you speak on that?
I suppose one of the contributions of the early pioneering thinking in organics, sort of going back to the 1930s and 40s, was this re-evaluation of weeds that are the bugbear of farmers, of plants of disturbed soil and cultivation, of recognising them as mining unavailable minerals, stabilising ground, soaking up surplus nitrogen, quickly creating ground cover to stop the loss of soil carbon. And then the permaculture contribution has really been recognising the wider field of what are called environmental weeds that are often not necessarily so much a primary problem for cultivators, but more generally vigorous plants in the landscape. And of course blackberry is a really interesting one because it was originally introduced by Baron von Müller in response to the catastrophe of gully erosion that was happening right across the landscape as a combination of the collapse of Indigenous management and large numbers of hard-hoofed animals damaging the original grassy open woodlands, creating these huge eroded gullies. And whether it was an appropriate thing or not, those blackberries were introduced to help stabilise that landscape. And no one has ever done an evaluation of how much that contributed to the stabilisation, because, of course, he was beseeching the government to sort of do something about the unregulated control of massive increase in livestock, and the huge catastrophes that were happening that created a lot of the, as Peter Andrews has identified, these massive eroded channels that we call creeks today. So of course at the practical end, we're working in one of the gold sluice gullies below our property for the last 30 years here in central Victoria, where blackberries and other plants, including willow trees, are actually part of the stabilisation process, the recapture of soil sediment, the rebuilding, of course, of carbon and water storage at an amazing scale and pace. So often we find that the plants that are most disliked are the ones that are doing that job most effectively in the current conditions. But of course we can go through a succession process where that moves on into a greater diversity of plants, or those plants are out-competed over time with things that, generally can provide a greater diversity of life, but also provide more in the way of livelihoods for people.
Yeah, I think the discussion, particularly around the willows, it has been a fascinating, there's been very divergent views, and there continues to be divergent views,
Yeah, and accepting that diversity is important, but some of those views have been supported by huge amounts of public money poured into projects with very poor evaluation, which has been very good for the chemical companies. and very little support for some of the other exploration. So I've never been against farmers having a go at doing things, and if they think, removing willows, might be a good thing. But what I'm against is this, funnel of public money that in a war against weeds, which is completely unscientific and, has no evidence base to sort of really justify both that expenditure of human capital, some of it, massed volunteer capital, but of course also with the support of Monsanto.
Yeah. So I have to ask you, David, on a totally different topic, and totally agree with you on your thoughts there. A lot of our farmers quite often ask us how practical and applicable are permaculture principles to broadacre farming, to our farmers.
Yeah.
And I'd love to cover that conversation with you.
Yeah, and look, I think you'd have to say that permaculture, at least in the Australian context, has had relatively little direct impact on farming. Both at, like in other countries that are highly industrialised with very high labour costs and cheap, reliable food, that impact of permaculture has been less. Whereas if you look at the other end of the spectrum, in developing countries, and especially ones where there's extremely dysfunctional economies, for example, like Zimbabwe, there's projects that are now at the level where they are training the agricultural extension officers as part of the whole government program of, usually under a framework which is called agroecology, which is of course one of the important, crossovers. So in the Australian context, it's been sort of almost the opposite. But I think some of the areas that we prefigured in permaculture, the focus on tree crops and the long-term potential for more of human food to come from trees rather than the incredibly problematic nature of broadacre growing of annuals for our staples. And I frequently say to people, look, grazing in Australia, the predominant land use, can be regenerative, but grain agriculture is still really, really tricky. And of course, we've got some brilliant examples of people doing it well, but it's that turning over the soil or the chemical alternative to it that's been so problematic. Now, in permaculture movement, I don't think in practice there's been limited success in that, the use of nuts and species like oaks. But the Badger Set Research Farm in Minnesota, which quite parallel to the early developments of permaculture, is now at the level that they have these neo-hybrid swarms of hazels and chestnuts and pecans that are producing carbohydrate and protein at levels competitive with the highest yields of corn and soybeans in the Midwest of the United States. So we do actually have now, in limited places in the world, evidence of tree crop systems that can rival, the greatest of annuals. I think more significantly, at a lower tech level, the development of silvopastoral systems and the recognition of trees that grow vigorously and provide fodder for animals as complementary to pasture grassland systems, which is also one of those early ideas of permaculture. We have seen a bit of that, expressed in Australia. Things like Tagasastia. At one point there were 64,000 hectares in the 80s of Tagasastia in Western Australia. Unfortunately, the economics of fence-to-fence property, boundary-to-boundary cropping has sort of pushed back a lot of that use of shrubs and trees for animal fodder. But Tagasastia, Lucina, Saltbush and others have shown that they can actually outproduce a lot of pasture species in providing fodder for animals, survive drought, and in that complementarity between the two actually be one of the fastest ways to sequester carbon. Now, that being said, it's still a complex new thing of how you get large amounts of effective tree fodder, how you manage it with animals and all of those things. So there's not many places in Australia where we see that. But permaculture was certainly one of the key influences on the people who have, taken that role.
Yeah, I think the other discussion that we're really finding that's taking off right now is the multi-species crops, and what some of the broadacre farmers are actually doing, rotating the multi-species with some of their monoculture crops, which is what we do on our farm as well. And, last 2 weeks ago, we had our first rainfall, like slow rain all night for so long. Like, I just couldn't remember the last time that happened. And I went for a walk, and Mike has put in, that's my husband Mike, we've got a 3,000 acre property just near Inverell, and we put in a 22 multi-species crop on, and I remember walking up the hill, and because there was so much rain, the worms, I couldn't believe how many worms there were, and they were trying to get away from the water, and they were up on top of on the road, and there were worms all over the road. And I got so excited because it was the first time that I'd ever seen like actual worms outside the soil for a start. and the birds were all going crazy because they were trying to eat the worms. But the other thing is that I got home and I was so excited, and I told Mike, and Mike's dad was actually coming and having a cup of tea, and he said that he remembered his dad used to come home from the tractor and be really annoyed because he kept on having to stop and clean the worms off the tractor. Like, and now we've got this point where, because we've been using glyphosate and just constant chemical usage, we've lost our worms. So that multi-species crops that are just, I think, the first step for a lot of regen farms. The transition from conventional to regen is that multi-species crops. They've just been amazing.
Yeah, I think we saw that on our trip coming back from the West. One of the last places 2 years ago, after going through all the cropping country of southern Australia, which was really amazing, to drop in on our grain suppliers who are in our region, Burrum Biodynamics, and walk through their fields. It felt like, I shouldn't be walking on this paddock. It's like walking on a garden bed. Soil was so fluffy, and the multi-species and the amazing structure of soil that's been achieved. And of course, part of our view at the other end of the system of people living who aren't farmers, and our whole retro suburbia work is also encouraging people as gardeners and people connected to nature, producing their own food, to value what people are doing on the broad acres and support those people. So this collaboration through community supported agriculture and other ways to create these greater synergies of people valuing the farmers who are really doing this this regenerative work, and that valuing is really one of the key outcomes we're actually ironically seeing from people having a go at being food producers themselves, that they end up valuing people who do it for a livelihood. And of course, my larger vision with that, through an essay I wrote, Feeding Retro Suburbia from the Backyard to the Bioregion, is that we can bring a lot of the horticultural production straight back into where people live at home, but we depend on the regional hinterlands for livestock products and extensive staples and grains, and getting that appropriate synergy between those two worlds of production that we need to restart the the urban one where people live, because we know that a lot of the efficiencies in perishable food production are actually just much more suit doing it at the home scale, but we all need to get better at what we're doing.
I totally agree, and that's such a good introduction to your massive manual to our audience. Was looking at it last night. It looks fantastic. I don't think any one of our audience, I haven't seen it before, so I mean, please tell us all about it, because I can tell you, so many of the people we interview and so much of our community who's working within the Regen Ag space actually came to Regen Ag via permaculture. Most of them started with a book on permaculture or a documentary on permaculture, and that triggered their whole transformational thinking on the topic of how they could then apply that to their farming. And our audience, our amazing donor audience, and Kalinya, get your questions ready, because our amazing donor audience are predominantly in the suburbs and the cities. And they're forever asking us, how can we be more involved? We want to support this transformation of our food growing and our soil, restoring our soil, but how can we do it? So tell us everything about this beautiful, amazing book you've written.
Yeah, well, Retro Suburbia, in a way, is 3 books in one, because it's about the built, the biological and the behavioural, how we can retrofit what we've already got. We're going to be facing the climate and other unfolding crises, basically with the built infrastructure and the living situations of where people are. We're not going to rebuild some new whiz-bang eco-cities for the changed world. It's already on us. So that means, most Australians live in detached housing with potential to grow food. A whole lot of positives about suburbia that have been derided for decades, and that's being that sweet point between the connectivity we associate with cities and the access to resources, including soil, sunlight, space to make and do things that we associate with rural areas. So a lot of retro suburbia in a sort of policy vision sense is about re-inhabiting where we live, spending more time at home, kickstarting the household and community non-monetary economies. And there's been a lot of people doing that, with the lockdowns and stuff. So the biological part, the garden farming, a lot of what people would associate with permaculture is a big part of that. And part of that's for resilience, part of it's for health, part of it's because it's actually more economically efficient to have competent gardeners growing food where people actually live than it is to do that on a large, very large scale logistics moving through the supply chains to moles and bullies. So I suppose in terms of some of the evidence base we're starting to see for that, slowly we're getting a bit of that. Just in terms of the productivity, Kat Labors, who's one of the case studies in retro suburbia, her documentation of her backyard food production over the last 5 years, now approaching 1/2 a tonne of food from a day's work or less in a very small suburban garden at the real small end, not much more than 100 square metres of actual productive space. So we're starting to see that evidence of productive possibility, and also the synergies that can happen with what I call urban agriculture, actually using the bigger public open spaces, private open spaces. So in feeding retro suburbia, I suggested we could be developing a bioregional food system where there's 1/4 of the food is coming from home production, 1/4 is coming from urban agriculture, and 1/2, from the rural hinterlands. And we're also seeing some evidence starting to come from other functions that come from that. For example, the Shire of Whittlesea did a study by their stormwater engineers looking at what are the site-based alternatives to hardening our infrastructure to deal with stormwater disasters from climate change. Because, engineers have actually been on this case for quite a while and know that there's big changes that got to happen. And they found that just modelling a suburb that had been hit by an extreme event, if water tanks were installed at every house, they could cut the peak storm flows in those big events by 30%. And then if all the soil around each of those houses was fluffed up, organic garden soil, I said it's a bit unrealistic for every square metre to be like that, but the modelling showed that combined with the water tanks, they could reduce it 80%. And that was then approaching what was the assumed runoff regime of the indigenous grassy woodland landscape that existed before Europeans covered everything up with paving. So we're starting to see, just in that water side, you can see, of course, also the connection that soil, of course, achieves that structure by being full of carbon, full of life, all the things that are necessary to be efficiently growing food. Because we can grow a few native shrubs on, the most compacted bit of clay, but we can't really grow food in soil like that. We've got to focus on that soil wherever we are and whatever scale. So there's some of the ways in which, the retro suburbia work, connects to this vision of how we sequester carbon. Of course, it's also doing a huge amount to reduce our emissions of carbon, because when we grow our own food and bypass the whole transport system, all the packaging, all the logistics, we're sequestering a bit of carbon in our tiny little sort of areas, but we're massively reducing also our emissions of carbon dioxide through the industrial system. And of course, that's not necessarily good for expanding the larger scale industries and economies that are doing that. So this home-based non-monetary economy, from a point of view of central governments, is to some extent can be seen as economic treason, because it leads to a contraction in GDP.
Yeah. And I know with the book you also cover building, don't you? Different building models.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Yeah, and retrofitting what we've already got. So, for example, in southern Australia, solar greenhouses attached on the north side of buildings are one of my favourite sort of add-ons that obviously link the productive outdoor home-based productive lifestyle with passive solar heating of a house to reduce our heating needs. But there are a million other retrofits and that encourage us to make more use of what we can already do at home. And a lot of those things are also a bit more questioning of a lot of the environmental orthodoxies. Like, we're great fans of energy efficient forms of wood burning as carbon neutral part of the cycling carbon economy, and increasing resilience, and ways that can be done in ways that are low in terms of their localised pollution problem, which is obviously an issue with wood burning. Rather than saying, we've got to all become in some sort of high-tech bubble with technology all made in clean room manufacturing in China, and we'll somehow exist separate from nature. So we see wood and wood burning is actually part of our ancestral relationship to nature, and we should be, making use of that where appropriate.
Yeah, the fire burning one is fascinating just from a cultural Indigenous knowledge keeping, and the yarns around the fire and how important it is that fire is very mesmerizing and it's actually very therapeutic. So that fire is a really big one to really feel nurtured by, and I think that sometimes you can throw the baby out with the bathwater on some of these things, can't you?
Yes.
Really, yeah. Yeah.
I don't know, the new Earth energetic's going to look like the old Earth, and the old Earth energetic's going to end up looking like the AI smart cities. Whereas there's going to be such an inversion there. The smart cities are going to look at this sort of like new Earthers, the hippie, the regeneratives, the perm, go like, what sort of lifestyle are you living, sitting around these old open fires and sitting on wooden chairs and going to community halls and marketplaces? We're going to look antiquated. This new Earth, it's going to look antiquated to this rollout.
And of course, if we look at, the most efficient forms of, rocket stoves and other simple, amazingly simple technology, we're actually approaching the environmental efficiencies and pollution levels of, the latest European computer-controlled wood furnaces that meet all the European clean air standards, but order their fuel over the internet when they're low, so that we see ways in which design, which permaculture, of course, is really about, and understanding, the science and technological principles like passive solar design, that remarkable simple technologies. Another one in Australia, which we actually take for granted as a vernacular technology, but has been part of Australia's permaculture export of sustainable technologies, is the water tank, collecting water off the roof. Now, we wouldn't call that permaculture in Australia. It's just, this is ordinary. But, in a lot of places in the world, you can collect water off a roof and, it's safe to drink. And, so and of course, this is actually life-saving in so many places where people's springs and sources of water have dried up, and there is actually no history of collecting water, no culture of it. There's no gutters on roofs. So we see that, quite simple technologies can, combined with appropriate design, not achieve all of the needs we want, but a hell of a lot of them.
It's going to be smart cities versus simple cities. That's what it's going to end up being. Basically, all the new Earthers will be in the simple cities. So look, Helena, I want to open up to you, mate. You've been so patient. Welcome. Have you got any questions for David? Would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's really exciting to be here. You touched on a bunch of my questions already, but just going back to growing veggies in the city, I've sort of started doing my own stuff as soon as we bought our house, got into the garden. I've got 20 fruit trees and nut trees and that sort of thing. Everyone that I talk to excitedly about my vegetable garden is kind of I tried veggie gardening, I was really keen on it, but it didn't really work. They sort of tried it for a couple of months and then kind of gave up. What do you reckon is a good way to sort of encourage people to have that persistence with the veggie gardening and that sort of thing?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, because, our vegetables are our most highly selected plants, incredibly nutritionally dense. They're the most sort of fragile, wilting little things compared with tree crops or grains or, our larger landscapes, dependent on pasture plants. And sometimes there's a pattern where people start off with gardens and get a reasonable good result, and often even techniques like sheet mulching to start a new garden on a grass area can be very effective for a few years, and then the underlying trace element deficiencies and imbalances, when you're gardening on the same place, you're really pulling a lot out of the soil. And a lot of our horticulture actually works effectively in a sort of a rotation where you've got an exploitative phase for a year or two, and then it's put back into green manure crops or even pasture or whatever, and then it rotates around. Where we don't have the space and we're intensively gardening, it's much more difficult. So one option where people do have a bit of space is to really focus on that green manure rotations to help that rebuilding, rebalancing phase. And the other is to look at what amendments are needed, and that may mean that it's actually worth for serious food producers really getting soil tests done, or at least having that, especially at a neighbourhood level and on areas that are similar soil types, that you've got some sort of idea of what are the real key limiting factors, because sometimes organic materials that you're bringing in may have actually the same characteristic mineral deficiencies of what you've already got, and you're sort of recycling your deficiencies. And that is, you know, one of the aspects that limits people, and I think it's contributed over the decades to the level of enthusiasm for food production in different Australian cities. Like, I would say that Adelaide has a higher level of successful food gardeners, and sometimes people attribute it to all the people who migrated from the Mediterranean and came to a climate very similar to theirs, and that Melbourne's in the middle, and then Sydney's actually lower down. And when you look at the geological mineral base of those three cities, you find there's a lot of really crap soil in Sydney. You basically, you know, sand from the Hawkesbury sandstone. There's some better patches on the Ashfield Shale. And then in Melbourne, there's sort of a bit of a mix of the sedimentaries, which is sort of not too bad, and the eastern suburbs, and the volcanics in the west. And Adelaide, a lot of the Adelaide Plain is actually on, if dry, actually really good agricultural soils. And so this sort of background of, you know, people falling into becoming a green thumb is easier where the, you know, the background mineral base was better. And that doesn't mean to say you can't grow food if you know, on those poorer sites. You can obviously, with garden farming, you can transform soil in a way that farmers can't on a broad scale. But you're also so concentrated that, you know, things running off the rails, do need sort of more correction. So that's why in Retro Suburbia we did put a bit more, you know, tried to introduce a bit more into those technical aspects and understanding a bit of the things of mineral balances, which is all, you know, sort of a lot of it, so much of it, both on the biology side and the mineral side, is a bit the black magic of agriculture.
Actually, living in Adelaide, I'm really aware of the good soils that we have here, and it can be really discouraging seeing all of the new subdivisions and everything just covering over that soil with roofs and no gardens, and yeah, it is a little bit discouraging looking at that.
Yeah, I think one of the other things that's really important is, of course, pest animals in a lot of places, possums in a lot of places in urban areas, and again, Kat Labour's place, she ended up resorting to one of these little urban fence-top electric units, which transformed her ability to grow food after the possums, devastated her system. And the other one is just being aware of the limitations of large competitive trees like eucalypts, and especially in dry environments, that massive root competition that's possible, ironically, in the leafier suburbs. And that's why we sort of so much in southern Australia focus on modest size, mostly deciduous trees, giving you the shade in the summer, but, you know, having the sun and access to the the winter natural rainfall growing environment in the winter in climates like Adelaide.
David, we had a really great podcast a little while back talking about the incredible benefits of wood chip. It was Kelly, what was the name of those awesome women? I can't remember.
It was all about it was about the benefits of mulching and wood chips. It was really phenomenal what they were managing to pull off by just like layering and layering and layering these wood chips onto the ground.
And I think with the wood chip, that was fascinating. We actually had a whole heap of our council basically just when they cut the smaller trees off the side of the road and the dead branches, they were actually putting them into wood chip, and basically we could go and just pick them up from the side of the road. And I just did a bit of an experiment where I used the wood chip, and I actually found that because it was, most of them were eucalypts, that the eucalypts are I'm finding a little bit problematic from the wood chip perspective, because when you're putting in sort of peas and some of those, they're actually not the nitrogen fixing stuff. They don't seem to work as well. So I found that fascinating, that when you get your wood chip, you need to find out the actual type of trees, the wood.
Well, it's a matter of sort of thinking of biomass from the sweet, soft, succulent stuff. Imagine something like lucerne hay or pea straw being at that very calcium dominated, and when we think of things like eucalypt trees, pine trees, they're at the other extreme of being more potassium dominated. Yes, they support fungal decomposition, but it's actually sort of finding that balance for food crops. Generally, wood chip is more suitable for our perennial foods, trees and shrubs and berries, and in moderate quantities, or getting things started, suitable sometimes in vegetable gardens, but generally we like to recycle the soft, lush vegetation to those same areas and woody materials to the same areas. Certainly at Melliodora, we chip a lot of our trees here, that the leftovers are what we feed to our goats, our silvopastoral system, and that goes to gardens. But what we're chipping are acacias, tegasasti, rampant plum trees, oaks, willow, and you look at Melliodora, there's a few big eucalypts forming shelter belts at the fringes, but there's actually no eucalypts, no pines within our 2¼ acres of intensive permaculture systems, because those sort of trees are really not appropriate to that, and yet a lot of our woody biomass is like that. But on the other hand, if you're on calcareous soils somewhere like Adelaide, often a lot of even the native trees that are growing have got a not too bad balance. And so I know people in Western Australia and South Australia who found gung-ho use of wood chip mulching has worked for them year after year, whereas I know in a lot of places in Eastern Australia with more acidic leach soils that you're actually just creating a sort of an unbalanced system that isn't actually suitable for producing food. It might, grow some other things, but not so much food. So yeah, understanding all of the benefits and the limits of all techniques, and as our agronomist Gwyn Jones used to say, don't be a moron, like, oh gee, that worked, let's do double that. And so even something as mulching, and a lot of people in permaculture have got into that, of gung-ho massive layering of organic matter in gigantic quantities, and over the years then, this is then not working so well, even though it was working well at the beginning. So that difference between what's the techniques to start a system going and what's the methods to sort of keep it ticking over, because they're not necessarily the same thing.
Yeah, I think also, when you're just starting off, I just think about, we are sort of large-scale farmers, and I think about how many of us us farmers in regional Australia actually have their own gardens. Like, it's quite remarkable, isn't it, that we produce all this huge amount of food, but we don't even have our own garden. So I think that for us as farmers, if we can actually just, this process of actually getting to understand our garden and the connection of our food, and that's actually the thing. Like, even if you don't think you can do it, there's so many incredible benefits of just starting the process, getting to understand how nature works. I mean, even if your crop fails, even if you can't get, even if you can't get them to grow, there is something like wonderful in understanding that this is, working with nature is so important.
Yep.
Calinula, you got any last questions before we wrap up the show?
Yeah, I've got one more.
Go for it.
I've recently started working in the certified organic industry. You touched on that a little bit just right at the very start. And, coming into the industry kind of fresh and with a bit of a regenerative agriculture background and stuff has been really, it's good to see the thoughts behind it, but the certification can seem really clunky at times because it's all about ensuring product integrity over big supply chains and that sort of thing. As a consumer, I think like what we would all love to do is go to a farmer's market and know our farmers and buy all of our food where we know the farms, where we know where it's coming from. But, when you're trying to live a little bit of a smaller life, maybe you're bike riding everywhere, it's not always practical. So supermarkets is sort of where you often get most of your food from. What do you think is a good way for like a consumer to promote that sustainability over like trying to sort of join those two things together, like maybe organics that are coming from like overseas versus like trying to source your food locally?
We would tend to bias things towards the local, the small supply chain over the globally certified and transported organics, because generally those systems, the larger the transportation, especially of perishable food, the larger will be the production system scale, more driven to pushing towards the normal issues, and including actually a lot of issues around workers' rights and stuff like that. Although organically certified international food is still way better than the rest of the supply chain at that scale. So yeah, we would favour that, and from a permaculture perspective, even be tolerant of people who are not necessarily working within organic certification, and that direct relationship or smaller scale is important. I gave a presentation at the Adelaide iPhone conference, the big international conference in early 2000s, I think it was, and sort of really focusing on this aspect of organics, away from organics being global industry. And there's obviously that debate there, and some of it is between people from the fringe like myself, but also a lot of the pioneers of organics say, no, like you've got to restrain the way this has become this, corporate controlled industry at the top. And that debate's still, going on within the organic. The difference between organics as a movement, I suppose, and organics as an industry, that tension is there.
David,
where possible, connect to the local.
David, I think it's fascinating that you don't consider yourself a pioneer. You're very humble indeed.
Well, in the organic context, there were some of the old conservatives who are saying the industry needs to, understand it's part of this great movement. And there was this person coming from the fringe talking about the challenges of energy descent, and actually giving same message as a radical fringe person, and it was actually interesting, this synergy between the conservatives and the radicals. Maybe we're all
well, I think we're all needed. The radical fringe is definitely needed. And David, let's give a plug for your book. So how do we, if anyone is interested in buying your books, you've got your online store, of course, where would they go?
Yeah, so they can go to Holmgren Design and get that online. There's also the online version of the book, because during the pandemic we decided to make it available as a read online digital form, so people, and that's on a pay what you feel basis, which was a big decision we made, because the book, of course, it's a big book. It's $85, and it's also available in a lot of good bookshops now. But we have our own distribution system which bypasses Amazon, and we've had 100% boycott on Amazon in our publishing business. So you can't buy it on Amazon.
Radical. I love it. I love it. Well, I highly recommend the book, and to our particular audience, I think so many of you are going to get so much out of it. So many of your questions are going to be answered. So many of your inspirations met. So much knowledge there for you to apply everything you love about regeneration of our planet and our food chain in your backyard, in the cities and the suburbs. So highly recommend. And David, it has been an absolute pleasure to speak to you. So wonderful. It's such an honor. My very first, way before CARBON8 and REGENER8 and all the things we've ended up, my very first introduction to permaculture was on a documentary about Cuba, about community in Cuba. And I just was so proud of Australia in relation to what we achieved, introducing that to the world. So my greatest honor to meet you. You have been a hero of mine for a very long time, and I know I'm speaking on behalf of everyone who's watching today. So thank you for joining us, David. It's been our privilege.
Great to be with you, on your podcast, and fantastic work that you're doing. So keep it up.
Thanks, David. And thank you, Kalinya. This is really fantastic. You're our very first inaugural donor, and hopefully we get lots more. So thank you for your contributions. It's been wonderful, really great.
Really amazing. Thank you for joining us today. So we will say thank you and goodbye, everyone. Have a lovely rest of your day, and we will see you next time on REGENER8.
Australians have been living in a dream world of cheap energy, low interest rates and benign climates. But there are ominous signs of a weather change on multiple fronts. Retro Suburbia describes the patterns of retrofitting the house, garden and household that make for a better way of life now and build resilience to uncertain futures. In the suburbs around the country, the early adopters of a quiet revolution are getting their own house in order, growing and processing food, retrofitting buildings and sharing house to reduce debt rather than waiting for governments to provide answers. I anticipate a strengthening of neighbourhood sharing and in turn revitalised local livelihoods without the need to commute. My book balances the larger world context with local, practical and creative solutions to help people plan and work towards a more resilient future. In Retro Suburbia, in the behaviour section, this chapter on self-reliance and resilience through changing our habits is a huge opportunity to retrofit ourselves, retrofit what we do an idea that a lot of people are sort of vaguely attracted to, but it seems the practicalities of having to work away have impeded people from making that change. So the pandemic combined with information technology is this huge opportunity to change. Multitasking during the day rather than just doing one set task is of course one of the great freedoms of home-based lifestyle.
Change is something that you can do on a very small basis. Make a little plan for something that you really think that you'd like to change, like reducing your packaging in the foods that you buy, or changing over from toilet paper and not having to buy that. Many things in change involve reducing what you think you need. We have the bulk drawers here. The bottom drawers I use for grain. Stocking up makes you feel rich. I like to have my things around me, like the food in the garden is the bank, and the food in the drawer is the bank. So that's been a big thing, buying in bulk and sharing with other people in the community. So that is really important, that the household is not just a closed unit, but that home-based lifestyle emphasises that that's our base from which we work out and connect. Another aspect of changing habits is a lot of the habits we have at home, when we actually look at it, are incredibly inefficient. So how to actually not make the home like a factory, but how to bring some of that productivity or efficiency that we often associate with the workplace actually back into how we do things at home, just to make it easier for ourselves so there's actually less work to do.